Picture this. The year is 1305, and the cobblestone streets of London are about to witness something so horrific, so deliberately savage, that it would echo through the centuries as one of history's most calculated acts of brutality. The man at the centre of this nightmare wasn't just any prisoner, he was William Wallace, the Scottish knight whose very existence had become an affront to English power. What happened to his body after capture wasn't simply an execution. It was a methodical destruction designed to obliterate not just a man, but everything he represented. But here's what most people don't realize about Wallace's final hours. The popular imagination, shaped by Hollywood films and romantic ballads, has sanitized this story into something almost noble, a quick death for a brave hero. The reality was infinitely more sinister. What the English crown orchestrated wasn't justice, it was theatre, a carefully choreographed spectacle of cruelty that would serve as a warning to anyone who dared challenge royal authority for generations to come. Today we're stripping away the myth to examine the unflinching reality of what they actually did to William Wallace's body. And I promise you, the historical accounts are more disturbing than anything Hollywood has ever dared to show. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why this execution became the blueprint for state terror in medieval Europe, and why the very method chosen would haunt the collective memory of Scotland for centuries. To truly grasp the horror of Wallace's fate, we need to understand the world that created it. Medieval Scotland in the late 13th and early 14th centuries existed in a brutal reality where the concept of nationhood was still forming and loyalty was often determined by survival rather than sentiment. This wasn't a time of chivalrous knights and noble quests. This was an era where political power was maintained through calculated displays of overwhelming violence. Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, was not a king who tolerated defiance. His reputation had been forged through the ruthless suppression of Welsh resistance and his systematic expulsion of entire populations. When Edward came to rebellion, understood a fundamental truth about power. It could spread like wildfire if not thoroughly extinguished. Wallace's success at Stirling Bridge in 1297 had proven that English heavy cavalry could be defeated, that Scottish independence wasn't merely a romantic dream. This victory transformed Wallace from a minor landowner into something far more dangerous, a symbol. The hunt for William Wallace lasted years and involved an extensive network of spies, informants, and collaborators. Edward placed a substantial bounty on Wallace's head, and the English administration in Scotland worked systematically to isolate him from potential supporters. The net gradually tightened as former allies turned against him, driven by fear, greed, or simply the desire to survive in a world where association with Wallace had become synonymous with death. The betrayal came in August 1305, likely through Sir John Montague, a Scottish knight who had submitted to English rule. The exact circumstances remain debated by historians, but the outcome was clear. The man who had become the living embodiment of Scottish resistance was now in English hands. His capture was celebrated in London as a great victory, but for Edward it was only the beginning of what he intended to be Wallace's ultimate humiliation. The journey from Scotland to London was itself a form of psychological torture designed to break Wallace's spirit before his final punishment. Bound and heavily guarded, he was paraded through English towns where crowds gathered to see the infamous Scottish rebel. This wasn't just transportation, it was a transformation of a hero into a spectacle, a leader into a curiosity. By the time Wallace reached London, he had already endured weeks of degradation, but his ordeal was far from over. The trial of William Wallace was a legal farce, but it served an important propaganda purpose for the English crown. Held at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, the proceedings were conducted in Latin, a language Wallace likely didn't understand. He was charged with treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and various other crimes against the English crown. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Wallace was being tried for treason against a king he had never acknowledged as his sovereign. When given the opportunity to speak, Wallace reportedly declared that he could not be guilty of treason against Edward because he had never been Edward's subject. This defiant response sealed his fate, though in truth the outcome had been predetermined. The trial was theatre designed to provide a legal veneer for what was essentially state-sponsored revenge. The judges, all appointed by Edward, had no intention of showing mercy. The charges against Wallace were carefully crafted to justify the severity of his punishment. Treason was the most serious offence, punishable by the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The additional charges of murder and sacrilege were meant to portray him as a criminal rather than a warrior. The English legal system had become a weapon of state terror, and Wallace was to be its most prominent victim. The sentence was pronounced with ceremonial gravity. Wallace was to be drawn through the streets of London, hanged by the neck but not until dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and his body cut into 4 parts. Each element of this punishment carried symbolic meaning. The drawing represented his degradation, the hanging his rejection by heaven, the disemboweling his spiritual corruption, and the quartering his complete destruction. This wasn't merely execution, it was annihilation. But what made Wallace's punishment uniquely horrific wasn't just the method chosen. It was the deliberate public nature of every moment, the way his suffering was transformed into entertainment for the masses. Medieval London had never seen anything quite like what was being planned for this Scottish night. On the morning of August 23rd, 1305, the sky was clear and warm in London. The city had been preparing for this spectacle for days, with scaffolds erected and crowds gathering from across England. The authorities had turned Wallace's execution into a public holiday, complete with vendors selling food and drink to the assembled masses. This wasn't just about the power of the English justice. It was entertainment, a reminder crown, and the fate that awaited those who dared challenge it. Wallace was first stripped and bound to a hurdle, a wooden frame that would drag him through the streets. The route was carefully planned to maximize both humiliation and spectacle. From the Tower of London, where he had been held, the procession moved through the busiest districts, ensuring as many people as possible would witness his degradation. The cobblestones tore at his flesh as he was dragged behind horses, leaving a trail of blood that marked his final journey. The crowds lining the streets were a mixture of curiosity seekers, English patriots, and those who simply enjoyed witnessing suffering. Medieval executions were public events, serving both as entertainment and stark reminders of royal power. Spectators jeered and threw refuse at Wallace as he passed, their behavior encouraged by the authorities who wanted to ensure his final moments were as humiliating as possible. The procession moved slowly, allowing maximum time for the crowds to gather and for Wallace's suffering to be prolonged. Contemporary accounts describe him as conscious throughout this ordeal, his eyes fixed on some distant point as if seeing beyond the immediate horror of his situation. Whether this was defiance, resignation, or simple shock remains unknown. What witnesses did note was that he never cried out or begged for mercy, a detail that would later become part of his legend. At Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, a scaffold had been erected specifically for Wallace's death. The crowd here was even larger and more boisterous than along the route, with vendors selling pies and ale to spectators who had claimed the best viewing positions hours earlier. The carnival atmosphere was deliberate. The English authorities wanted Wallace's death to be remembered not as martyrdom, but as a celebration of English justice and power. What happened next at that scaffold would become one of the most meticulously documented executions in medieval history. The English wanted every detail recorded, not just for legal purposes, but because they understood they were creating a historical moment. This was intended to be remembered, studied, and feared for generations to come. The executioner who awaited Wallace was a professional who had likely performed dozens of such killings. He understood his role wasn't simply to end a life quickly, it was to orchestrate a precise sequence of torments designed to extract maximum suffering while keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. The method of hanging, drawing, and quartering had been refined over decades into a horrific art form, and Wallace was about to experience its full horror. The executioner began his grisly work with practiced efficiency, but what followed defied every expectation of medieval justice. Wallace was first hanged by the neck, but the rope was positioned to ensure strangulation rather than a quick death by breaking the neck. The crowd watched as he struggled for breath, his face turning purple, his body convulsing in the universal dance of death by asphyxiation. But just as consciousness began to fade, he was cut down, still alive, still aware of what was happening to him. What came next was the most horrific part of the entire ordeal, and it's here that the historical accounts become almost too disturbing to believe. While Wallace was still conscious, still breathing, the executioner began the process that would transform this execution from mere killing into something far more sinister. Using a sharp knife, he cut open Wallace's abdomen and began removing his internal organs one by one. Contemporary chroniclers described the victim's screams as unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of human suffering itself. The executioner held up each organ for the crowd to see before throwing it into a fire that had been prepared specifically for this purpose. The symbolism was not accidental. In medieval thought, the bowels were considered the seat of emotion and compassion. By burning them while Wallace watched, the executioner was symbolically destroying his humanity, reducing him to something less than human in the eyes of the crowd. The smell of burning flesh and organs filled the air, adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish scene. Through all of this systematic destruction, Wallace remained conscious. His eyes stayed open and aware, even as his body was methodically dismantled. Some accounts suggest he continued to speak, though his words have been lost to history. The executioner's skill lay not just in causing maximum pain, but in keeping the victim alive as long as possible. Death, when it finally came, would arrive as a release rather than the culmination of suffering. But the horror didn't end with Wallace's death. What the English authorities did to his corpse would prove even more calculated in its cruelty than the execution itself. His head was severed with a single stroke of a sharp axe, finally ending his suffering. But even in death, the humiliation continued. His head was held up for the crowd to see, blood still dripping from the severed neck before being set aside for later display. The body was then cut into 4 quarters, each piece held up for the crowd's inspection like cuts of meat in a butcher's shop. This quartering wasn't just brutality, it was a deliberate act of political communication. The English understood that symbols could be as powerful as armies, and Wallace's dismembered body was about to become a symbol of English dominance spread across Scotland. The disposal of Wallace's remains was as calculated as his execution had been. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it and mounted on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging English authority. But it was the distribution of his body parts that revealed the true sophistication of English psychological warfare. The 4 quarters of Wallace's body were sent to different Scottish cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were displayed publicly as reminders of the fate that awaited rebels. Each piece served as a message to the local population, a physical reminder of English power and the consequences of resistance. The choice of cities wasn't random. Each had strategic importance and local populations that needed to be reminded of their subjugation. At Newcastle, Wallace's right arm was nailed to the city gates where merchants and travellers would see it daily. Berwick received his left arm, displayed prominently in the marketplace where townspeople gathered for trade. Stirling, the site of Wallace's greatest victory, was chosen to receive one of his legs, a deliberate insult to the memory of Scottish triumph. Perth received the final quarter, positioned where it would be visible to anyone entering or leaving the city. The preservation methods used ensured these grisly trophies would remain visible for months, even years. The body parts were treated with salt and tar, preventing decay while maintaining their recognizable human form. Local officials were given strict instructions about their display. They were to be positioned prominently, replaced when they deteriorated, and accompanied by proclamations explaining what fate awaited those who defied English rule. The psychological impact of this distribution cannot be overstated. For medieval people, the integrity of the body after death held profound spiritual significance. The deliberate scattering of Wallace's remains across Scotland was understood by contemporaries as an attack not just on his physical being, but on his very soul. The English were attempting to deny him proper burial, to condemn his spirit to eternal restlessness. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how the English authorities turned Wallace's execution into a form of public education. Detailed accounts were written and distributed, not to glorify Wallace, but to explain the justice of his punishment. These documents, preserved in English archives, reveal a sophisticated understanding of propaganda and psychological warfare that seems almost modern in its calculation. The official records describe Wallace's crimes in lurid detail, emphasizing his alleged attacks on innocent civilians and his rejection of rightful authority. They paint his execution not as the destruction of a patriot, but as the justified punishment of a criminal who had brought suffering upon himself through his own choices. This narrative was carefully crafted to transform Wallace from martyr into cautionary tale. Contemporary chroniclers noted the immediate effect of Wallace's execution on Scottish morale. Many who had supported the resistance either fled the country or submitted to English rule, calculating that no cause was worth such a horrific death. The brutal spectacle had served its purpose. It had successfully demonstrated the futility of opposing English power. Yet the English had miscalculated something fundamental about human nature and political resistance. The very excess of Wallace's execution began to work against its immediately, rather intended purpose almost than crush Scottish resistance. The brutality of his death actually strengthened it in ways Edward could never have anticipated. Robert the Bruce, who would later become King of Scotland, was reportedly moved to action by the spectacle of Wallace's execution. The manner of Wallace's death influenced the tactics of future Scottish resistance, creating a culture where fighters preferred death in battle to surrender. The knowledge that capture meant torture and humiliation beyond imagination led to more desperate and determined forms of warfare. The international community watched Wallace's execution with a mixture of fascination and horror. Foreign dignitaries reported the details back to their own courts, contributing to England's growing reputation for extreme measures. This reputation would influence diplomatic relations for decades, as other European powers came to understand the lengths to which English authority would go to maintain control. The extensive documentation of Wallace's execution provides historians with a remarkably detailed picture of state power. The me of medieval justice antiquolus records kept by English officials reveal not just the facts of what happened, but the mindset behind it, the careful calculation that went into every aspect of the spectacle, from the route of the procession to the distribution of body parts. What emerges from these historical accounts is a portrait of state terror that was both sophisticated and deeply personal. This wasn't the random violence of an angry mob. It was the calculated application of psychological warfare by a regime that understood the power of symbols and the importance of controlling narrative. Wallace's execution became a template for how rebellious subjects should be dealt with, a playbook for state violence that would influence English policy for generations. The legacy of what happened to Wallace's body extends far beyond the immediate political consequences of his death. In the centuries that followed, his story became a foundational myth of Scottish nationalism, inspiring generations to resist foreign domination. The very brutality of his execution transformed him from a failed rebel into a symbol of martyrdom that proved more powerful in death than he had been in life. The transformation of Wallace from rebel to martyr illustrates the unpredictable nature of political symbolism. Edward had intended the execution to demonstrate the futility of resistance, but instead created a powerful symbol of the nobility of sacrifice for principle. The very excess of the execution contributed to its failure as a deterrent. The horror was so complete that it became sublime, transcending its immediate purpose to become something larger and more enduring. But the story of Wallace's body doesn't end with his death and dismemberment. What happened in the weeks and months following his execution reveals even more about medieval attitudes toward death, power, and remembrance. The English authorities had not simply killed a man, they had created a complex web of political theatre that would continue to unfold long after Wallace drew his final breath. The preservation and display of Wallace's remains required constant maintenance and oversight. Local officials in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth were given detailed instructions about caring for their grisly charges. The body parts needed regular treatment with fresh tar and salt to prevent complete decay. Weather damage required repairs. Storms could dislodge a limb, requiring it to be repositioned and secured. Ravens and other scavengers posed constant threats, necessitating guards and protective measures. These mundane details reveal the extraordinary commitment the English made to maintaining Wallace's posthumous humiliation. Significant resources were devoted to ensuring his body parts remained visible and recognizable. Local treasuries funded the materials and labor required for preservation. Guards were assigned and paid to protect the displays from both natural elements and potential sympathizers who might attempt to steal the remains for proper burial. The psychological impact on local populations was immediate and profound. Children grew up seeing Wallace's decomposing flesh as part of their daily landscape. Merchants conducting business had to pass beneath his severed limbs. The constant presence of human remains in public spaces created an atmosphere of perpetual reminder about the consequences of defying English rule. Contemporary accounts describe how people reacted to these displays. Some crossed themselves and hurried past, treating the remains with the reverence typically reserved for religious relics. Others deliberately avoided the areas where Wallace's body parts were displayed, taking longer routes to conduct their business rather than confront the grisly reminders. A few brave souls left flowers or small offerings near the displays, acts that were quickly discovered and punished by local authorities. The English response to these small acts of remembrance reveals their understanding that Wallace's death had not achieved its intended effect. Rather than inspiring submission, his execution was generating a different kind of resistance. Quiet acts of defiance that honored his memory and rejected the narrative of justified punishment. Local officials reported these incidents to London, leading to increasingly harsh penalties for anyone caught showing respect to Wallace's remains. The treatment of Wallace's head on London Bridge deserves particular attention, as it became perhaps the most visible symbol of English dominance. London Bridge was one of medieval Europe's most remarkable structures, lined with shops and houses, and serving as a crucial crossing point for the Thames. The southern gatehouse, where Wallace's head was displayed, was already crowded with the skulls and heads of previous traitors and criminals. But Wallace's head was given a position of particular prominence, mounted on a pike taller than the others, and positioned to be visible from both directions of travel. The tar used to preserve it gave his features a dark, almost demonic appearance that contemporary observers found deeply unsettling. Foreign visitors to London invariably commented on the sight, and many recorded their impressions in letters and journals that survive today. The head's location wasn't chosen randomly. London Bridge represented the gateway to England's capital, and anyone entering the city from the south would encounter Wallace's preserved features as their first glimpse of English justice. This positioning was designed to communicate that England's reach extended far beyond its borders, that even Scottish rebels would find their way to London's gates, transformed from heroes into warnings. Maintaining Wallace's head required specialised knowledge and regular attention. The tar had to be reapplied periodically to prevent complete decay. The iron spike supporting it needed occasional replacement as weather and weight caused metal fatigue. Records show payments made to craftsmen for these services, revealing the bureaucratic apparatus that supported this display of state power. The preservation wasn't perfect. Contemporary descriptions note how Wallace's features gradually changed over time. The tar caused the flesh to darken and contract, creating an increasingly grotesque appearance that some observers found more terrifying than the fresh corpse had been. The eyes had been removed early in the preservation process, leaving dark sockets that seemed to stare accusingly at passers-by. Weather took its inevitable toll despite preservation efforts. Rain washed away some of the tar, requiring reapplication. Wind sometimes shifted the head's position on its spike, creating an unsettling sense of movement that frightened observers. Winter frost and summer heat caused the preserved flesh to crack and split, necessitating repairs that maintained the display's recognizable human features. The psychological effect of Wallace's head extended beyond simple intimidation. Medieval people believed strongly in the spiritual significance of proper burial, and the public display of human remains carried profound religious implications. Many observers saw Wallace's preserved head as evidence of divine judgment, either punishment for his sins or martyrdom for his cause, depending on their political sympathies. English authorities encouraged interpretations that supported their narrative of justified punishment. Official proclamations reminded viewers that Wallace's fate represented God's judgment on rebellion and treason. Sermons preached in London churches used his execution as an example of divine justice, emphasizing how those who defied rightful authority would find themselves abandoned by heaven. But alternative interpretations circulated despite official efforts to control the narrative. Whispered conversations in taverns and markets suggested that Wallace's preserved remains possessed supernatural properties. Some claimed his head's expression changed with the weather, appearing more serene during peaceful times and more anguished before storms. Others reported strange sounds emanating from the bridge at night, as if Wallace's spirit remained trapped within his preserved flesh. These folk beliefs reveal how Wallace's death had begun generating the very mythology that English authorities sought to prevent. Rather than serving as a simple deterrent, his execution was creating a complex web of supernatural associations that transformed him from rebel into something approaching sainthood in the popular imagination. The economic impact of maintaining Wallace's remains provides another lens through which to examine this extraordinary act of state theatre. Local officials in the cities receiving body parts had to allocate significant resources to their care and display. These costs included not just materials and labor, but also the opportunity costs of having valuable public spaces occupied by instruments of political intimidation. Guards assigned to protect the displays represented a substantial ongoing expense. These men had to be paid regular wages, equipped with weapons and shelter, and replaced when they fell ill or proved unreliable. The positions were not popular. Standing guard over decomposing human remains carried both practical discomforts and spiritual anxieties that made recruitment challenging. The materials required for preservation created their own supply chains and economic relationships. Tar, salt, iron spikes, and other necessities had to be procured regularly and transported to display sites. Local blacksmiths found themselves specializing in the hardware required to mount and maintain human remains. Merchants developed expertise in the chemicals needed for preservation. These economic networks reveal how thoroughly Wallace's execution had been integrated into the normal functioning of English-controlled territories. His death wasn't a singular event, but the beginning of an ongoing system of political communication that required constant maintenance and investment. The English crown was committing significant resources to ensuring that Wallace's message of deterrence remained visible and effective. The social impact on communities forced to live with Wallace's remains was equally complex. Children who grew up seeing decomposing human flesh as part of their daily environment developed different relationships with death and authority than previous generations. Parents had to explain why these grisly displays existed, often struggling to balance official narratives with their own moral sensibilities. Religious leaders found themselves in particularly difficult positions. The display of human remains conflicted with Christian teachings about the dignity of the dead and the importance of proper burial. Yet challenging these displays directly would constitute defiance of English authority. Many chose to focus their sermons on abstract concepts of justice and divine will, avoiding direct commentary on the specific remains in their communities. Local merchants and craftsmen discovered that the presence of Wallace's body parts affected their business in unexpected ways. Some customers refused to conduct transactions near the displays, finding them too disturbing or spiritually troubling. Others were drawn by morbid curiosity, creating crowds that could be either beneficial or disruptive to commerce. The displays also created new forms of social interaction and community bonding. Shared exposure to these reminders of state power created common experiences that residents could discuss and interpret together. Some communities developed subtle codes for expressing sympathy with Wallace's cause without directly challenging English authority. As months turned to years, the preserved remains began to deteriorate despite maintenance efforts. This gradual decay created its own psychological dynamic, the slow transformation of recognizable human features into abstract symbols of mortality and power. What had begun as specific punishment of William Wallace gradually became a more general meditation on death and authority that transcended its original political purpose. The deterioration process wasn't uniform across different locations. Climate, local maintenance practices, and community attitudes all influenced how quickly Wallace's remains lost their human characteristics. Some body parts retained recognizable features for years, while others became skeletal remnants much more quickly. These variations in preservation created different experiences for different communities. Residents of cities where Wallace's remains deteriorated quickly might gradually forget the specific historical context, seeing only abstract symbols of English power. Those in areas where preservation was more successful maintained more direct connections to the original execution and its political meanings. The English authorities monitored these developments carefully, understanding that the effectiveness of their political theatre depended on maintaining the right balance between recognition and horror. Remains that deteriorated too quickly lost their deterrent effect, while those preserved too perfectly might generate excessive sympathy or supernatural associations that worked against English interests. This careful management of decay reveals the sophisticated understanding of psychology and politics that informed English policy. The execution of William Wallace wasn't simply an act of revenge or justice, it was a calculated experiment in social control that extended far beyond his death. The English were pioneering techniques of political communication that would influence governance for centuries to come. The international ramifications of Wallace's treatment continued to unfold as foreign observers processed what they had witnessed. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals how other European courts interpreted these events, often seeing them as evidence of English barbarity rather than strength. The execution that was meant to demonstrate English power instead contributed to England's growing isolation from continental European politics. French officials, already suspicious of English ambitions, used Wallace's execution as evidence that English rule was fundamentally illegitimate and cruel. Spanish and Portuguese observers, dealing with their own domestic rebellions, noted the methods with interest but also with concern about their implications for international law and civilized governance. The papal court, despite its complex relationship with Scottish independence, expressed private concerns about the spiritual implications of denying proper burial to any Christian, regardless of his political activities. These concerns didn't translate into direct intervention, but they contributed to broader European skepticism about English claims to moral authority. The ripple effects of Wallace's execution reached into corners of medieval society that the English crown had never anticipated. In monasteries across Scotland, monks began recording alternative accounts of his death, versions that emphasized his dignity in suffering rather than the justice of his punishment. These chronicles, written in secret and hidden away, would survive for centuries to challenge the official English narrative. The psychological warfare that Edward thought he had mastered was beginning to backfire in ways that revealed the fundamental limitations of terror as a tool of governance. Reports reached London of increased recruitment for Scottish resistance groups, with Wallace's name becoming a rallying cry rather than a warning. Young men who had never met him were willing to die for the cause he represented, viewing his tortured death as proof of English cruelty rather than Scottish futility. What's particularly fascinating is how the English authorities began to realize their miscalculation. Internal correspondence between English officials reveals growing concern about the unintended consequences of their spectacle. Local governors reported that mentioning Wallace's name in public could trigger riots or demonstrations of defiance. The very displays meant to intimidate were becoming pilgrimage sites for those who viewed him as a martyr. The bureaucratic apparatus required to maintain Wallace's posthumous punishment reveals just how deeply the English had committed to their strategy of terror. Administrative records show regular inspections of display sites, detailed reports on the condition of preserved remains, and careful monitoring of public reactions. This wasn't casual brutality, it was systematic psychological warfare that required ongoing investment and attention. The most disturbing aspect may be how quickly this extraordinary cruelty became normalized within English governance. What began as an exceptional punishment for an exceptional prisoner gradually transformed into standard procedure for dealing with political dissidents. The techniques pioneered in Wallace's execution would be refined and applied to countless others over the following decades. The story of William Wallace's body stands as perhaps history's most chilling testament to power's capacity for calculated cruelty. What Edward intended as the ultimate demonstration of English dominance instead birthed a legend that would outlive empires. The very brutality meant to crush Scottish resistance transformed a failed rebel into an immortal symbol of defiance. Today, as we witness our own struggles between authority and freedom, Wallace's tortured remains remind us that some principles transcend even the most horrific consequences, and that the human spirit, once ignited, proves impossible to dismember.